Okay, so we are studying a style of art that was developed in Germany starting around 1905 and going through the start of World War II, called German Expressionism. Now, artists after this time can be often referred to as expressionist, or their artwork would be considered part of expressionism. But we're going to focus mostly to start with German expressionism, which started around the beginning, the lead up to World War One, and ended kind of during World War Two. And just to remember, World War One was a 4-year war, 1914, 1918, and World War II just started not too long from there. So less than 20 years went by, and we were in another World War that lasted for 10 more years. Now, some of the other influences, obviously, we've got World War One and World War Two, which made a huge influence on the artists' lives, but also an abrupt encounter with an increasing industry and industrialization of people's lives, and urbanizations, meaning the growth of cities and people having to move into cities. Also, another influence is similar to one of the artists we studied, Aaron Douglas, who was very inspired by the African art that he was seeing. The Expressionists were also inspired by African masks and folk art, as well as oceanic artwork. So here are some examples of things that they would be seeing pictures of and seeing in museums. That would be African folk art, like the mask on the right, and oceanic folk art, like the mask on the left, and also like the statues from Easter Island. So World War II was vastly different than other world wars. The technology was different. The poverty that was one of the reasons that caused, the wars was extreme. The amount of deaths was extreme and greater than any wars before, because the technology that they had was really increasing. The technology and weapons, such as submarines, poison gas, warplanes, and tanks, made this like a new sense of deadliness, the greater numbers of deaths. Okay, so before that, they didn't have these kind of weapons. So that really um, made this a more horrific war than any war before. And some of our artists that we're going to look at actually were involved in the war, were soldiers, and their lives were greatly changed and, in some ways, warped by this war. World War One, had poisonous gas. That was a new thing, and it, you know, looks weird. Look at it with those masks. That was a new thing. It's kind of crazy. It was an upheaval, and people were in an upheaval. For Germans, World War One was a financial crisis. Afterwards, especially, um, banks began to disappear as loans were paid, and deposits that were in those banks were useless. Um, in November of 1920, 1 million marks, which is like their dollar, could buy somebody only 3 pounds of meat or 2 glasses of beer, um, which is not much. But just later that year, it would take 200 billion marks to get that loaf of bread. So you can see how the years between the two world wars were really bad for Germany. Their money was useless, and their lives were very difficult. Um, and the characteristics of this artwork are pretty simple. Focus on strong colors, distorted figures, mostly human figures, a huge focus on emotions and feelings rather than artists being a camera. Often those feelings and emotions were related to isolation and alienation. Bold paint strokes and dark lines often. We could use the word primitive to often describe it, as in not very civilized. Um, a lot of exaggeration. Also, keep in mind that writers and movie makers, people who made movies of the time, were also a part of this expressionist movement, and they focused on the same focus of emotion and feelings and distortion as the painters. So the one on the left, the painting on the left, I bet you've seen before. It's Edvard Munch's The Scream. He's a little before the expressionists mostly, but he could be described as an expressionist. So if you look at the painting on the right, you can see those bold colors that are not very realistic. You can see how the faces are kind of distorted. Um, and you can see those dark lines that define the edge of the person. Take a look at the African mask. You can see how both pieces of these, the artwork in the middle and the artwork on the left, really kind of, are similar to that African mask. Here's another image. Besides the human figure, also landscapes were seen, um, and there's a sense of distortion. They employed distorted forms to reflect the tension and anxiety of living as an emotional individual in the mechanized modern world, and to affect the audiences on a psychological level. So they didn't just want to make things look like they looked in real life, they wanted to hit the emotions that they were feeling. So if you look up close, there's a lot of emotion and distortion in that person's face. The way the buildings are, breaking apart, there's a lot of distortion there. Here's another one. You can see how it looks like the streets are slanted, like almost a little trippy. German Expressionism was one of the most influential movements of the 20th century, and they were aiming not to depict something accurately, but to express emotion. They often used strong, contrasting colors. So look at the bright red and the bright green. They really contrast off of one another. And they're not realistic colors either. They're looking to reflect the tension and anxiety of living as an emotional individual in the mechanized world and to affect their audiences on a psychological level. Now, if you look at the artwork on the left, this is what the Expressionists were rebelling against. The picture on the left portrays things in this ideal world, and it looks like a happy place, and they look like they are trying to make it look real. Now they're rebelling against that. So the painting on the right looks raw, deeply emotional, and shocking. The figures are kind of distorted. Certainly, there's clashing colors, and the colors are not really realistic. Um, these artists felt muzzled or contained by the morals and um, traditions that were around them, and they were looking to rebel against that. So, at the turn of the century, meaning the very early 1900s, there was an air of discontent. Malaise is another word for discontent or unhappiness. Um, and it settled over the creative haunts or the places where creative people would gather to discuss their art, like taverns or art schools. Artists across the cities in Germany were frustrated. They really felt constricted by the traditional artwork that was being shown. So the artwork here on this page shows how they were not looking to make it look realistic. They were looking to illustrate real life, um, but not realistically. They're looking to show the real inner life of emotions. Now, the artwork on the left is very different from the Expressionists. In the summer of 1937, two art exhibits were on display in Germany. One glorified the German state. An example of an artwork that would be glorifying the German state would be on the left, while the other exhibit was created with the intention of shaming and debasing or offend, like trying to make the artwork look bad, making the expressionist artwork on display look shameful. And they were very critical of it. The expressionist artwork was displayed amongst graffiti that was shaming and attacking the artwork. This was a very famous exhibit, was seen by millions of people, and it was known as the degenerate artwork. Now, a degenerate is something or someone who is not normal. The Nazis considered expressionist artwork dangerous, and they were just driven to destroy this art movement. Afterwards, after this exhibit, um, the degenerate exhibit, thousands of expressionist artwork were taken without permission and disappeared, and they were destroyed. And some of their creators were as well. Many artists fled Germany, some stayed, but their careers were ruined, and some of them ended up taking their own lives. Um, the Nazis were not very good to these artists because they didn't feel like it was normal, and they didn't feel like it was reflecting Germany in a good light. So, this is another example of showing how Expressionism is very different from the artwork that came before it. So, the artwork on the left was from the mid 1700s, and it's based on Adam and Eve, is the subject. And you can see how the tree looks realistic, the skin looks realistic, the body shapes look pretty realistic. But if you look at the expressionist artwork on the right, there's a distortion. The eyeballs seem to be bulging and glowing in a very unrealistic way. The colors are very unrealistic. And there's a sense of clashing and anxiety because those colors are so vibrant, and it's almost like this chaos that occurs. So you can see how it's not very realistic. It's mostly focusing on the emotion of the piece. So here are two more expressionist artworks. You can see there's a lot of distortion. Look at the picture on the left, how his top of his head looks bulbous, really large. And it seems to shrink as the head goes down into the mouth, like it's shrunken. That's not very realistic. It looks like a funhouse mirror. A lot of distortion. The colors are distorted. In the picture on the right, the eyes do not seem to match. The left side of the head doesn't seem to match the right side of the head. There's this sense of distortion. And we'll be focusing on distortion as well. And we'll be focusing on emotion. The emotion we focus on doesn't have to be the anxiety that I feel like is shown on the left. Looks like that person is very uncomfortable. We don't have to focus on anxiety, but we are going to focus on emotion. So again, these two pictures look like they are focusing on anxiety, on discomfort. There's a heightened emotional content, very emotional, and it's expressed with these aggressive colors and daring shapes. And we will be doing that as well. But again, your emotion doesn't have to be dread or anxiety. It can be a different emotion. But if you look on the left painting here, called Sick portrait, or sick man, sorry, it's a self-portrait of the artist. Um, you know, it just doesn't look well emotionally to me. Um, the artist was seeking to capture the individual's emotional experience rather than the objective view that of the world that we could all agree upon. And we will be showing our our subjective emotions in our next assignment. Here's another artwork done by the same artist, and Kirchner is the artist, and he was in the First World War. He had a nervous breakdown from his experience of the First World War, and this painting really kind of shows that anxiety that he felt over his experience of being in the war. Look how the arm of the hand has been chopped off. You know, he did not lose a hand in the war. I think it's more symbolic of perhaps, losing a sense of self, losing your hand, losing your ability to, it's his right hand. Maybe he felt like he couldn't paint for a while because of that. But it definitely shows that emotional angst. Here's another artist, Otto Dix. And again, he was traumatized by his experience of the First World War. And I think if you look at the characters portrayed in his artwork, must have been influenced by some of the bodies that he saw in the trenches. Um, and there's a morbid sense of his nightmares that he suffered from his experience in World War One. A lot of emotion here. Again, you don't have to focus on dread and trauma. The emotions that you express can be elation or extreme happiness, but it can't just be blah. We will be having bright, unrealistic colors, and we will have distortion, just like these two paintings. We'll be using a computer and paint. These are paintings. Both of these were done in the 20s. The one on the right, if you look, these characters do not have legs. And it's called Card Playing War Cripples, is what the artist named it. And so probably people he knew um, crippled by the war. If you look at the face of the card player on the left, um, it looks like his face was severely damaged. I'm not sure what that tube is coming out of his ear, but there's definitely a sense of trauma. The face on the left with those unrealistic colors, there's just like, I don't know, anger. Just look at her eyes, look at her face. She looks devastated and angry. Now, you don't have to be devastation and angry. You can be extreme happiness, right? You can be surprise. You can pick a different emotion. The German expressionists were going through a very difficult time. 2 world wars in a total of 30 years. It's difficult. Um, so here's some unrealistic colors. Look at the glowing eyes. So distorted heads. We're going to have distortion. We're going to be using the computer to do it. We're also going to look at the artwork of Francis Bacon, who did many portraits just simply distorting the face. He felt like the feelings of desperation and unhappiness were more useful to an artist than contentment and happiness, because desperation and unhappiness, he felt, stretched his whole sensibility. Now, one could definitely argue that point, that joy and happiness can be definitely reflected in our artwork, but we will have some emotion in our artwork. So here's some more of his distorted faces. Um, he wanted to upset the stability of ordinary point of view, and he wanted to break down the protective barriers separating us from the mundane life and experience. Um, then he wanted to separate us from reality. Now, Francis Bacon was born in the early 1900s, but he didn't really get his artistic career going until the late 40s. And we would use the term expressionist to define him. but he was not German. So, what is our first step? Our first step is to take a photo of your face or somebody else's face exhibiting an extreme sense of emotion. You get to pick the emotion, but you need to take the photo. It can be you, it can be a selfie, but by the time we're done with this, I don't want people to be able to identify you. So don't worry about it. Because I'm pretty sure that the mother of these two people in these two paintings would not recognize them. So we're just going to be focusing on the emotion you're going to portray. I want you to think of yourself as an actor in a movie. And I want you to show that emotion and get a photo of it. That's your first step. All right? Once you have that, we'll talk about your next step.